Welcome back after the break. Isobel left us describing the situation in Dunoon. Back to you, Isobel.
The situation in Dunoon was probably predictable. One sees it everywhere. The tension between economic interests, or what people think are their economic interests, and principles and risk. So Dunoon was divided. We had, on the one hand, people who thought, oh, the prospect of Americans here and business, and the others who thought this is a heightened risk, or also who were simply opposed to the whole idea of having weapons of mass destruction on their doorstep. And, you know, some of it was particularly predictable. We had taxi drivers who were especially hostile. One time I remember we were traveling over on the ferry from Guruk for a demonstration the next day. This was in the evening, and we had a whole group of prostitutes from Glasgow over, and they were shouting at us, "You're just out to stop our business." I mean, it is so sad and so pitiful, but there you are. And that kind of strand, we find this in relation to any kind of military activity which creates business or jobs. There are always going to be tensions of that kind. But there were some very strong supporters in Dunoon as well, and surrounding area. Now, what happened in September 61 is that, having worked all summer, having got so many promises of support, come the day, and it was a gigantic September storm. And those of us organising had gone over the night before, so that was fine. But the ferries couldn't get over. So what happened is that buses, many buses that were organised to come, some of them got through. Others who couldn't get over in the ferries had to get buses organised to take them round the very long route, which means that we had a demonstration, a march, quite a large march, but not nearly as large as it would have been, because people were coming in waves. And when it came to the actual sit down itself, there were eventually, I think it was about 380 people arrested, but they were arrested, it was comparatively easy for the police, they were arrested in waves because we didn't all get there at one time. And so you weren't able to make the impact, and there were still a considerable number of people who never got there at all, who had intended to come. So it made a pretty big impact, and it was a large number of arrests, the largest that there had ever been probably in Scotland for that kind of civil disobedience, but not nearly as effective as it might have been. Now, one of the problems that always happens is that you can build up campaigning, especially when something is about to happen, the hope that you might be able to stop it when it arrives at first, but it is so hard to sustain campaigning on a particular development once it has become a fait accompli, or people feel it's a fait accompli. And we tried to keep up campaigning. We did lots and lots of things. We had protest, some of us had protest fast a week long at Rosyth. We had the same a bit later at Faslane. We had, I remember, a Christmas one just outside Glasgow Cathedral. And we had all kinds of attempts to get the message across in the media. And of course, remembering in those days there were many more newspapers, they were more important, but nevertheless you were not entirely dependent, but overwhelmingly dependent on press coverage and to some extent television coverage, although it wasn't nearly as widespread then, anything like it as it became now. So what really happened was that I think there were quite a lot of people, particularly the younger people, who just drifted away from politics. I know what I did politically. I'd left the Labour Party. I wasn't at that point attracted to going into any other party, but I focused Tom McAlpine, my husband, who was also very much an anti-nuclear campaigner. He had been a Labour councillor in Hamilton over that period, and he set up Round Engineering, which was a cooperative engineering factory, which tried to assert the principles of not doing anything that would contribute to militarism in Kinning Park in Glasgow. And I helped with a community project in the surrounding area, which was a very educational experience. It was doing good works. I think that was our feeling. Party politics, where has it taken us? We kept on campaigning those issues, but we put a lot of emphasis on doing good works. Now, what happened, there was also, of course, the Cuban crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we had to organise, of course, very quickly on that, and we had telephones, landline telephones, but you didn't have any of the means that we have now of communicating. The one means that we had then, which we don't have now, was that you had big workplaces, big factories. And that was very important then for communication, because if you had shop stewards who were sympathetic, the unions could get word out quickly, and it could be round a whole labour force of several thousand, within a matter of hours. So there were means of communication that we had then, which we don't have now to the same extent. So I remember we very quickly, the day the standoff, the Cuban standoff took place, we managed by that evening to get a modest demonstration march in Glasgow. But of course, once that crisis had been settled, that also, I think, created perhaps a wider public mood. Maybe the worst is over, maybe the Soviets and the Americans will come to some kind of better understanding. Maybe the risk is less. So there was a bit of that in the mood too. And of course, there was the Vietnam War, and quite a lot of protest was focused on that, both here and in the UK as a whole. So you had big demonstrations, particularly in London, against the Vietnam War. So that was happening. Now, if we jump to the situation in 1966-67, then you had started to get increased support and activism by the SNP. It actually started 63, 64, you know, you had Billy Wolfe in West Lothian in 64. And certainly in 67, earlier in 67, when the Pollock by-election was on, with George Leslie standing there and putting up a very good show, I found myself, by this time, of course, I had graduated, I had done a social work training, but then I went into research work. I was working with the Royal Commission on Local Government, and then I had just started a postgrad master's degree at Strathclyde University. And I just found myself during that by-election arguing with other members of staff for independence. I wasn't thinking at that time of joining the SNP, but I just found it was becoming more prominent as an issue, and I was making the case for. So by the time we got to the Hamilton by-election, then you know, my interest in that of my husband was growing, and just the night when he won Hamilton, we talked about it, and I said we should really probably go back into party politics and try and make it work. And I think the SNP, in terms of our other, one other factor, by the way, we did know Billy Wolfe, because Billy had been supportive of the Brown Engineering Company, the Factory for Peace enterprise, and Billy had been supportive of that. So we had met him. And I can remember what I did. It's a terrible cowardice on my part, but we were living, the constituency we were in there was Govan constituency. And I said to my husband, but what happens if we go along, if we join and we find that there are people who are pro-bomb or who are hangers and floggers, and we don't really fit. So I said, you go along to Govan constituency, see what it's like. Now, in fact, the prospective candidate, we didn't know them, the prospective candidate in Govan was Michael Grieve, Hugh McDermott's son. And my husband came back that evening and said, fine, you'll feel entirely at home. And so we joined the SNP. Now, one of the things that is interesting is that there was nothing concerted about this. You know, people didn't get together and talk about it. But in no time at all, we realized that people who had been active, we knew as activists in the anti-nuclear movement at the beginning of the 60s, we came across in the SNP in that period, late 60s into the 70s. Keith Bovey, for example, who had been chair of Scottish CND, had joined the SNP, and Chrissy McWhirter, who had been on the Scottish CND executive right from the start, she had joined. She's the mother of Ian McWhirter, the journalist, and Chrissy became, in the mid-70s, SNP National Secretary. And Mary Stewart and her husband Doogie, who were Mary was again, I think she was secretary of SCND. That's when I knew them at the beginning of the 60s. I think she became assistant national secretary of the SNP in that period. So there were a whole range of people you came across and realized that you had met them last in the anti-Polaris campaign. And I think what had happened is that there had been additional reasons why many people had left the Labour Party. And it was the fact that they had altered their policy, obviously on unilateralism, that they had come out and were prepared to justify atmospheric tests. But I think that the final nail in the coffin for many was in 1964, going into the election then, the Labour Party's official policy was not unilateral disarmament, but opposition to proceeding with the British Polaris project at Faslane. So that was the official Labour Party policy going into the 64 election. And when they got into power, Harold Wilson said, well, you know, very sad and all that, but we've spent so much money on this base development. We have gone so far down the route of this project that it's really not feasible to go back. And so they proceeded with the Polaris base at Faslane, the British Polaris base at Faslane. And I think there were a lot of people then who there were some, sadly, some who had been leading figures in CND who went along with the Labour government, who'd got elected. Some of them became ministers, and to the disappointment of many of us, they just toed the line. So it was a lesson. First of all, you can never tell the people who are going to stick by their principles and the people who are going to go on this slippery slope, you know. Oh, we need to get power, so we'll just have to keep quiet about this for a while. And, oh, if I get a ministerial job, it will give me some influence, you see, to do good. So I'll just tone down my views. And on the other hand, the others who will stand by their principles. And my experience has been, it's not all that easy to predict who they're going to be. Many people have surprised me, but that in any case had happened by then. So by the time we got to the late 60s, early 70s, it was almost like that the eruption of anti-nuclear activity in the Holy Loch campaign had created a kind of pathway to a strand, at least, in the eruption of the independence activity in the late 60s. And it was huge that there's a lot of, certainly many commentators and others who kind of underplay the significance and the size of that eruption of support in the late 60s and through the 70s. And they really are quite wrong in this, because there weren't so many opinion polls at that time, but the support for certainly a Scottish Parliament was very high. Support for the SNP was very high. There was a huge increase in membership. huge growth of branches all over. And it was an exciting period. And of course, I was no sooner a member than it was, shall we say, just about 6 months later, 7 months later, when I found myself an SNP councillor in Glasgow, not because it was my intention, but because at the last minute, someone stood down as candidate, and the local constituency in Kilmarnock came to me and said, by that time I was, I think, Secretary of Glasgow Area SNP, and came to me and said, will you stand? We're not going to win anyway. So I did, but unexpectedly found myself elected, and that's a whole other story. Now, this taking us into the period of the 70s, this was quite a quiet period for the anti-nuclear movement. And I think the reason that this is UK-wide and in Scotland, it continued, but at a much, much lower level. And I think the reasons for this, it was partly because people did think, look, there's progress being made in relation to nuclear testing and in just in international relations in general. The Cold War is getting just a little bit warmer. And so the kind of pressure was off. Secondly, there were major economic issues that were causing people a great deal of concern, that were dominating the political agenda. In Scotland, not just in Scotland, but people just forget how much this was a big, big issue at Westminster. The whole national question had become a very dominant one in Scottish politics. And the anti-nuclear side of it was a bit of that, but making the basic case for both independence or steps towards it, like a Scottish legislature, did take up, and dealing with the economic arguments took up a great deal of the time and the effort. But one has to remember that in 1970, although we had done disappointingly in the 1970 general election, with just getting 11% of the popular vote then, and only getting one MP, Donald Stewart in the Western Isles. But very quickly after that, in fact, just a few months after that, in the Stirling by-election, there was a very close SNP second place, and then a number of other very good performances, and of course the oil campaign, the discovery of oil. I was by this time vice chair for publicity, and we were very concentrated on developing the It's Scotland's Oil campaign at that time. And of course, by the September 1974 general election, the SNP got over 30% of the vote, and that is in a first past the post electoral system. It got 11 MPs, but it also got a very large number of second places. And so because the Labour government at Westminster was in effect a hung parliament. You know, initially had a tiny 2 or 3 majority over all other parties, but that vanished. So it had to keep the SNP on board, or try and keep the SNP on board. And this, as I say, is a whole other complex story, but it was a dominating issue in Westminster during that period, 74 to 79. Now, in terms of keeping the SNP on board, the anti-nuclear position, that wasn't difficult. There was an effort which for a period was successful, but then it got reversed again on NATO. There were some who wanted to reverse what had been the policy of not being NATO members. So there were a couple of battles on that line, but which we eventually won again. And on the basis of not being a member of any alliance, military alliance, which would use nuclear weapons. But in terms of the other aspects of policy, then there was not a difficulty, there was not any real dispute in the SNP about maintaining its anti-nuclear policy. And I think if anyone had wanted to reverse it at any time, they knew perfectly well they wouldn't win. So there was a clear, consistent line all the way through on that. And there were lots of people in the party for whom that was a genuinely important issue. And if I remember rightly, I remember Winnie Ewing saying that, for instance, she had been a CND member, I think just before she had been an SNP member. I'm just going there by memory. So that really wasn't an issue. The battles that dominated that period were obviously battles that were between those not wanting any compromise with independence and devolution, and others who felt the crucial thing was to get a Scottish legislature that was democratically elected. That was the red line, and that when we had that, that could be used as a base to move forward. Now, that's another whole issue around what happened then. But I'll move then into the 80s, because this was a very different period altogether. The SNP, incidentally, we'd done a lot of policy making through our National Assembly during the 70s. And I was Vice Chair for Policy, and I could see just how important it was that we were prepared in the expectation that we might get devolution and that we were ready for it. It was quite clear that in terms of whether we weren't likely to get control over defence policy in any way, but what our policy was. But across our whole range of policies, it has been suggested that the SNP somehow or other just became more radical, more social democratic in the 1980s. This just wasn't true at all. You look at all the policy documents in the 70s, very radical. The idea that the SNP would have managed to get through a non-radical land reform policy with Willie McRae there promoting it. Sadly, it was a much, much more radical land reform policy than we have today. And across the board, a lot of that work was done, I think, in establishing the SNP as certainly firmly rooted in a social democratic tradition, and much of it on the left of the social democratic tradition. Now, the 80s saw almost the reverse of the 70s. There was a huge growth in the anti-nuclear movement, but a decline in the independence movement. So it was the opposite of the 70s. And the reason for this, in terms of the decline of the SNP, although winning the 79 referendum, because of the 40% rule, it wasn't implemented, and we had the Thatcher government come in, and the SNP had a nervous breakdown, basically. We had people not just away in 2 different directions, but they were away in at least 3 different directions, very intensely and bitterly. We will leave that aside for the time being. But the main problem, I mean, lots of people didn't believe this, but I could see this, that the SNP wasn't likely in the 1980s to make a great deal of electoral progress. Now, this didn't mean that support for independence or support for very strong home rule couldn't make progress. Quite the contrary. It made significant progress, very important progress, but not the SNP as a party. And of course, people always thought, oh, well, we change our strategy, we change our slogan, we change our personnel, we do this, that. That wasn't the root of the problem. The root of the problem was that the Scottish people wanted rid of Thatcher. They wanted rid of the Tories. They saw that as a priority. We had in Scotland, people experienced in the space of a few years, 40% of Scotland's manufacturing industry disappeared, I think in 5 years. We had so much youth unemployment and older unemployment, and that's without moving on to the miners' strikes, and of course the poll tax and all the other issues. And people could see that you couldn't declare UDI. You had no base from which to do it. Now, it would be an exceptionally difficult thing to do it from a well-established Scottish legislature, which we have now. Possibly not entirely impossible, but extremely difficult even now. But then, what did you have as a base? And even if you had won 30 seats at Westminster, the Tories were absolutely adamant they were going to have nothing to do with even a modest form of devolution for Scotland. So lots of the Scottish public, that was their priority. How do we get Thatcher out? And the only way they saw of getting Thatcher out was getting Labour in during the 80s. And of course, in the course of the 80s, it had become, yet again, as often happens in opposition, a much more left-wing party. And ironically, yet again, for much of that period, it was strongly anti-nuclear, because there'd been a huge expansion, not just in the UK, in Scotland, but throughout Europe. The trigger for this was the Pershing and cruise missile, new developments, new bases, new sighting of these missile systems in different parts of Europe. the heightening of the Cold War with the Reagan administration and with Thatcher at the start of this period, and the feeling that this enormously belligerent approach, the new missile systems, which created lots of new opportunities for war by error or misjudgment or miscalculation. The experience of that just triggered a huge expansion of anti-nuclear activity. So we had big movements in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, in Denmark, in the Netherlands. The same was true in the UK. I've always had to get any friends and acquaintances in France by saying the exception was France for a peculiar reason. I'm not entirely certain. But of course, what that meant was Scotland wasn't the focus then, because these new missile systems weren't coming to Scotland, you know, in the early 80s. But nevertheless, the growth of CND took place again in Scotland, lots of new branches. We went round lots of places in Scotland with the War Game film. But there was something interesting in many ways that happened because of that. And that is, there was quite a lot of intermingling between left Labour people, SNP people, and others. And by that time, there was also a Green Party, well, it was Scottish Ecology Party, I think it was called then, but certainly the Green movement had expanded. And so you were getting this intermingling of people, the mutual friendships. So whatever the hostility there was at leadership levels, on the ground, there were people who were Labour Party activists, but they were working with people who were in the SNP, and an increasing number of Labour Party activists were so sick of the Tory governments at Westminster, the democratic deficit, that they were becoming much, much more enthusiastic. There were some who were complete converts, like Robin Cook, who'd been a leader of No in '79. He jumped the other way and became a very, very strong supporter in the 80s. So I think that was an important experience, because it did mean, when we move later on, when we get into the 90s, when we get into the attempts to get cross-party campaigning for a strong Scottish legislature, and that there were a lot of people who had been left Labour, and who had yet again, as they had seen in the late 80s, when Neil Kinnock did an about turn, someone who'd been very staunch CND supporter, and some others who had been extremely staunch CND supporters. When I think of the ones I spoke on platforms with, like Brian Wilson, and then as soon as Kinnock changed the line and it got through Labour conference on the basis, we've got to do this in order to win, but whisper in your ear, but when we're in power it will be different. Yet again, when that happened, they jumped ship right on to the anti-nuclear, the pro-nuclear line. It was quite shocking. And while they held on to most of their membership in Scotland, they lost quite a lot of them. And some of those they held on to, they held on to holding their nose. And so when the time came when they got sickened, they found it comparatively easy to move away. So I think that was one of the big lessons in the 80s, that the cross-party campaigning on the poll tax, on the anti-nuclear case, on unemployment, on support for the miners, these things built up a degree of goodwill, a degree of mutual understanding and trust that hadn't always been there in the past, and I think which made the big growth in the SNP that much easier. I think perhaps that might be an appropriate point to stop.
I think it would be a very appropriate place, but can I say on my own behalf, never mind SNP CNDs, I want to hear the rest of it. So I hope you come back. Isobel, that was absolutely fantastic. It was fascinating. I've learned a lot today. I lived through some of the stuff you've been talking about. I was there when Winnie Ewing's result came in Hamilton, because I'm from that neck of the woods as well. And I remember some of the songs I was singing in my head when you were mentioning them. But it was great to hear an awful lot I didn't know about, and I think the rest of the world are going to be fascinated by this as well. So until we meet again, thank you very much, Isobel Lindsay, for a fascinating talk. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jean.